In the dead of winter, 1944, there was a place on the Western Front the soldiers called the Ghost Front. It was a stretch of rugged, silent forest spanning the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, the Ardennes. Here, the war seemed to have fallen asleep. For the American GIs sent to this sector, it was a reprieve, a place to rest, to refit, to nurse wounds and write letters home from a war everyone believed was already won. The great German war machine, they were told, was shattered, broken on the beaches of Normandy, and bled dry in the fields of France. All that remained was the final push into the heart of the Reich. But in the pre-dawn blackness of December 16th, the forest began to speak. It started not as a roar, but as a whisper carried on the frigid air. A low, guttural rumble that wasn't thunder. For the lone sentry shivering in his foxhole, it was a sound that didn't belong. It was the clank of steel treads on frozen earth, the cough of 1,000 engines, the murmur of a ghost army stirring in the darkness. American soldiers reported these strange sounds up the chain of command, but their warnings were dismissed as the jitters of green troops, the echoes of a phantom enemy. The war was over here. It was a quiet sector. Then, at 5:30 a.m., the quiet sector became the epicenter of the apocalypse. Without warning, over 1,000 German artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The sky tore open. The ground convulsed. Trees that had stood for centuries were vaporized in an instant. For the men on the receiving end, it was a cataclysm beyond comprehension. The sound was a physical presence, a monstrous, shrieking thing that veterans would later describe as the sound of the world being ripped apart. It was the scream of the Nebelwerfer rockets, what the GIs called screaming memes, a weapon designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. Out of the smoke and the hellish glow of the explosions, they came. 250,000 men shrouded in white winter camouflage, surging forward like specters. And behind them, the steel beasts of the Panzerwaffe, King Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, a wave of armor that was not supposed to exist. This wasn't a patrol. It wasn't a localized counterattack. This was a full-blown offensive on a scale the Allies thought impossible. Hitler was making his final, desperate throw of the dice. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For the next 6 weeks, this forgotten forest would become the stage for the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. It was a conflict of shocking brutality, fought in sub-zero temperatures by men who were often isolated, surrounded, and fighting for their very survival. It was a maelstrom of courage and cowardice, of brilliant generalship and catastrophic blunders. History has often painted this moment as Germany's last great what if. The myth tells of a brilliant, daring plan that almost succeeded. A near-run thing where, if not for a few unlucky breaks, a patch of bad weather turning good, a few gallons of captured fuel, a single, stubborn town holding out, the Third Reich might have miraculously turned the tide of the war. We are drawn to this narrative, the story of the underdog gambler coming within an inch of winning it all. It's a dramatic, compelling tale. But it is a fiction. The central thesis of this story is that the Battle of the Bulge was never a near victory. It was not a stroke of genius that fell just short. It was, from its very inception, a strategic delusion. A plan born not of military logic, but of the fanatical, reality-detached willpower of a dictator cornered in his bunker. It was an offensive doomed by its own impossible mathematics, its fantastical objectives, and its catastrophic underestimation of the enemy it sought to break. We will deconstruct this myth, piece by piece. We will journey back into the final, desperate months of 1944 to understand the two opposing mindsets that collided in the Ardennes. An Allied high command blinded by a dangerous cocktail of victory fever and complacency, and a Nazi regime committing strategic suicide, sacrificing the last of its young men and war material on the altar of a fantasy. This is not the story of how Germany almost won, This is the story of how the Battle of the Bulge became the funeral pyre of the Wehrmacht, a gamble that didn't just fail, but accelerated the final violent collapse of the Third Reich itself. This was not a desperate lunge for victory, but the convulsive death rattle of a dying empire. To understand why the German offensive in the Ardennes achieved such stunning initial success, we must first understand the myth that it was built upon, and the reality that myth carefully concealed. The myth, perpetuated by post-war German generals in their memoirs and embraced by popular history, is one of a resurgent, still mighty Wehrmacht, striking with the precision and power of 1940. It's a narrative of elite SS Panzer divisions, unstoppable King Tiger tanks, and crafty generals catching a naive and overconfident American army completely flat-footed. In this version of the story, the German soldier is still the formidable warrior of legend, and only overwhelming Allied material superiority and the fickle hand of fate stood between him and a history-altering victory. This myth served a purpose. For the defeated German military establishment, it salvaged a measure of pride from the ashes of total defeat. For the Allies, it magnified their own eventual victory by portraying the enemy they vanquished as a near unbeatable foe. But like all powerful myths, its foundations are built on half-truths that obscure a far more complex and desperate reality. To find that reality, we must rewind the clock to the autumn of 1944. For the Western Allies, the world was awash in the intoxicating glow of victory. After the breakout from Normandy in late July, Allied armies had raced across France with breathtaking speed. Paris was liberated on August 25th, an event that seemed to signal the imminent end of the war. Soldiers who had been fighting hedgerow by hedgerow in Normandy were now advancing dozens of miles a day against a German army that appeared to be in a state of terminal collapse. This rapid advance created a powerful psychological phenomenon known as victory disease, a pervasive belief that the enemy was beaten and the fighting was all but over. The popular slogan was, "Home by Christmas." This optimism, while understandable, bred a dangerous complacency that permeated every level of the Allied command structure. But it wasn't just psychology, it was logistics. The Allied supply chain was a modern marvel, personified by the Red Ball Express, a massive, round-the-clock truck convoy system predominantly operated by African-American soldiers that ferried millions of tons of supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. But even this miracle of logistics had its limits. By the autumn, the supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles of French and Belgian territory. The single deep-water port the Allies had captured, Cherbourg, was heavily damaged. The crucial port of Antwerp, captured in early September, was unusable until November because the Germans still controlled the approaches up the Scheldt estuary. This logistical strain forced General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, to make a difficult choice. He couldn't sustain a broad front offensive into Germany. Instead, he had to prioritize. He funneled resources to Montgomery in the north for the ill-fated Operation Market Garden, and to General Patton's Third Army in the south for a push into the Saar region. This left the center of his line, the 80-mile-long sector of the Ardennes Forest, dangerously thin. Why the Ardennes? In the minds of Allied planners, it was a non-factor. It was rugged, heavily wooded terrain with a poor road network, considered wholly unsuitable for a major armored offensive. After all, the Germans had already pulled that trick in 1940, and lightning, they reasoned, doesn't strike twice in the same place. So the Ardennes became the quiet sector. It was a place to season green divisions, like the 106th Infantry, which had just arrived on the continent. It was a place for battered units, like the 28th Infantry, to rest and absorb replacements after being chewed up in the brutal Hurtgen Forest fighting. The American presence there was a thin screen, a tripwire. The entire sector was held by just two corps, roughly 80,000 men, stretched out and vulnerable. Allied intelligence, suffering from the same victory fever-induced confirmation bias, saw what it wanted to see. Reports of German troop movements and armor concentrations were consistently misinterpreted as defensive preparations for the coming Allied assault. The idea that Germany could mount a major offensive was deemed not just improbable, but laughable. On the other side of the line, in the crumbling heart of the Third Reich, no one was laughing. The situation in the autumn of 1944 was nothing short of catastrophic. In the east, the Soviet Red Army, in its colossal Operation Bagration, had annihilated German Army Group Center, inflicting perhaps the greatest military defeat in German history. Soviet forces were now hammering at the gates of East Prussia and poised on the banks of the Vistula River, directly threatening Berlin. In the west, the Allies had liberated France and Belgium. In the south, Romania had switched sides, depriving Germany of its vital Ploesti oil fields, a blow from which its armored forces and air force would never recover. At home, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was relentlessly pulverizing German cities and industries. Albert Speer, Hitler's ruthlessly efficient armaments minister, looked at the balance sheets of coal, steel, and oil and saw the mathematical certainty of defeat. He privately warned Hitler that Germany had, at best, the resources for one more year of war. The nation was being bled white. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that a group of high-ranking German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944. The plot failed, and Hitler emerged from the wreckage of the Wolf's Lair not just alive, but psychologically transformed. He saw his survival as an act of providence, a sign that he was destined to lead Germany to victory against all odds. His already deep-seated paranoia metastasized. He now profoundly distrusted the traditional Prussian officer corps of the Wehrmacht, whom he saw as defeatist traitors. He turned instead to the unwavering loyalty and ideological fanaticism of the SS, men like Heinrich Himmler and Sepp Dietrich, whose military competence was often secondary to their political reliability. This paranoia fused with a desperate need to regain the initiative. Hitler understood that a purely defensive war was a slow death sentence. He needed a stunning victory, a thunderclap that would shatter Allied morale and, he believed, fracture the unnatural coalition between the capitalist West and the communist East. To fuel this final gamble, the Nazi regime squeezed the last drops of lifeblood from the German nation. Joseph Goebbels' total war mobilization reached its fanatical peak. Theaters, universities, and non-essential businesses were closed. The age for conscription was lowered to 16. Millions of men were combed out of reserved occupations and factories. The result was the creation of new divisions, the Volksgrenadier or People's Grenadier divisions. On paper, they looked formidable. In reality, they were a hollow echo of the Wehrmacht's former glory. They were filled with teenagers, men in their 40s and 50s, convalescing wounded, and personnel transferred from the now useless Navy and Air Force. Their training was rushed, their equipment a hodgepodge of obsolete German weapons and captured Soviet artillery, and their transport was often horse-drawn. They were brave, but they were brittle. Yet, a dangerous paradox emerged. Despite the bombing and the resource shortages, German war production in 1944, under Speer's direction, reached its zenith. More tanks, more assault guns, and more aircraft rolled off the assembly lines than in any previous year of the war. This created a powerful illusion of strength. The Reich had a new army and new equipment. What it critically lacked was fuel to run the tanks, trained pilots to fly the planes, and experienced non-commissioned officers to lead the new infantrymen in combat. It was a magnificent shell with a hollow core. And it was this hollow shell that Hitler would hurl at the unsuspecting Americans in the Ardennes, gambling everything on one last, impossible dream of victory. The genesis of the Battle of the Bulge can be traced to a single, unshakable conviction lodged in the mind of Adolf Hitler, that will alone could reshape reality. By September 1944, with his generals counseling strategic withdrawal and consolidation, Hitler was thinking only of attack. He summoned his senior commanders to his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, a damp, fungus-ridden concrete bunker complex that had become his entire world. It was here, isolated from the front lines and surrounded by sycophants, that he unveiled his grand design. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive and deceptive name for an operation of breathtaking audacity. The plan he presented was not a suggestion. It was a Führer directive. He envisioned a powerful armored thrust, a Panzerkiel, smashing through the weak American lines in the Ardennes, the very same terrain that had brought him his legendary victory over France in 1940. The spearheads would then race to the Meuse River, cross it, and then pivot northwest, driving a wedge between the British and American armies. The final, glorious objective was the port city of Antwerp. The strategic logic, as Hitler saw it, was twofold. First, capturing Antwerp would sever the main Allied supply artery, strangling the armies of Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton. This would create a massive pocket, trapping as many as 30 Allied divisions, leading to a second Dunkirk. Second, and perhaps more importantly in Hitler's mind, was the political goal. He was convinced that the alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union was a fragile, unnatural pact. A catastrophic military defeat, he reasoned, would shatter their morale, spark bitter recriminations between the British and Americans, and force them to sue for a separate peace. This would free Germany to turn its full attention to the existential struggle against Bolshevism in the East. It was a vision rooted less in military science and more in a mystical belief in his own destiny. He spoke of Frederick the Great, who, on the brink of defeat in the 7 Years' War, was saved by the sudden death of the Russian Empress, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Hitler was seeking his own miracle, a modern-day reversal of fortune brought about by a single, decisive blow. His generals were aghast. Veteran field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model saw the plan for what it was, a fantasy. They understood the state of their forces. They knew about the fuel shortages, the undertrained troops, the lack of air cover. They argued for a more limited, achievable objective, the small solution, an attack aimed at encircling and destroying the American forces around Aachen. This might inflict a stinging tactical defeat on the Allies and buy Germany precious time, but it lacked the war-winning Wagnerian grandeur that Hitler demanded. He dismissed their objections as the tired pessimism of a defeated officer class. The big solution would proceed. To execute this vision, the Wehrmacht assembled the last of its strategic reserves. 3 armies were tasked with the offensive. The main effort, the decisive blow, was entrusted to the north, to the 6th SS Panzer Army. Commanded by the fanatical Nazi and former bodyguard Sepp Dietrich, it was packed with the most powerful formations Germany had left. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. These were elite, battle-hardened, and ideologically motivated units equipped with the newest Panther and King Tiger tanks. They were to be the unstoppable iron fist that would smash its way to Antwerp. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under the skilled and more professional General Hasso von Manteuffel was tasked with a supporting role, protecting the flank of the main advance and driving towards Brussels. On the southern flank, the 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, was given the critical but thankless job of protecting the entire offensive's left shoulder from the inevitable counterattack by General George S. Patton. As Patton's U.S. Third Army, Brandenberger's army was the weakest of the 3, comprised largely of the new, ill-equipped Volksgrenadier divisions with almost no armor and reliant on horses for transport. This southern shoulder was the Achilles heel of the entire operation from day one, a flaw the German High Command knew existed but lacked the resources to fix. The entire plan hinged on 3 critical factors, none of which the Germans fully controlled. First, speed. The armored columns had to reach the Meuse River within days, before the Allies could react and redeploy their reserves. Second, surprise. Absolute secrecy was paramount. And third, weather. The offensive needed a prolonged period of thick fog and low clouds to ground the overwhelmingly superior Allied air forces, which would otherwise turn the advance into a slaughter. The German deception effort was a masterpiece of military stagecraft. Troop concentrations were built up under the cover of darkness. Soldiers were forbidden from lighting fires. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Hundreds of reconnaissance planes flew low-level missions over their own lines at night, not just for observation, but to create a constant engine drone that would mask the sound of tanks and trucks moving into position. Allied intelligence did pick up fragments of the buildup, but the pieces of the puzzle were never assembled correctly. The prevailing mindset at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was that the Germans were incapable of such an action, so the evidence was made to fit the preconceived conclusion. It was a defensive buildup. It had to be. On the night of December 15th, the German soldiers were finally told. After weeks of silent, clandestine movement, the objective was revealed. For the young, fanatical SS troopers, it was a moment of wild euphoria. For the weary veterans and the teenage conscripts, it was a more somber affair, what one called a hangman's meal. Extra ammunition was passed out. Rations of schnapps were distributed. In the cold, dark bunkers along the front, men nervously checked their weapons, their thoughts a mixture of fear, patriotic fervor, and grim resignation. Then, as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky on December 16th, the order was given. The artillery erupted, a rolling wave of thunder that shattered the winter silence. As the bombardment lifted, whistles blew, and along an 80-mile front, 250,000 German soldiers rose from their positions and charged into the swirling snow and mist. They slammed into the thinly held American lines with shocking force. The U.S. 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, stretched out and exposed, were hit by a sledgehammer. Communications were cut. Units were bypassed and surrounded. The initial chaos was total. For a few desperate hours, it seemed as if Hitler's miracle was unfolding. The great gamble was on, and the carefully constructed world of Allied certainty was beginning to crack. The myth was becoming a terrifying reality. The initial shock of the German offensive created a bulge in the Allied line, a deep salient that gave the battle its famous name. For the first 72 hours, a narrative of German invincibility seemed to be writing itself across the snows of the Ardennes. But war is a realm of friction, where even the most brilliant plans collide with the stubborn, messy realities of the battlefield. And the German plan, far from brilliant, was fundamentally brittle. Its unraveling began almost the moment the 1st Panzer lurched forward. A forensic breakdown of those first crucial days reveals not a near success, but a cascade of failures. The most critical of these occurred on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Here, Sepp Dietrich's 60th SS Panzer Army, the most powerful force in the offensive and the key to capturing Antwerp, was tasked with breaking through a series of wooded ridges, the most important of which was Elsenborn Ridge. They slammed into dug-in positions held by experienced troops of the U.S. Feet Corps, including the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. The terrain was a defender's dream. The dense forests and limited road network channeled the mighty German tanks into narrow, predictable corridors, turning them into perfect targets for American anti-tank guns, artillery, and mines. The SS troops, imbued with an arrogant belief in their own superiority, launched brutal, costly frontal assaults. They were repulsed with staggering losses. By December 18th, just 2 days into the offensive, the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance on the critical northern route had been decisively stopped. This single failure, so early in the battle, effectively doomed the entire strategic objective of reaching Antwerp. The northern arm of the pincer was broken before it could even begin to close. Further south, where von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army did achieve a deep breakthrough against the overwhelmed 106th and 28th Divisions, a different kind of friction took hold, the logistical nightmare. The Ardennes had only a handful of all-weather roads. These quickly became colossal traffic jams. Tanks, assault guns, horse-drawn artillery, fuel trucks, and infantry columns were all crammed onto the same narrow paths, moving at a crawl. The German plan demanded the speed of a blitzkrieg, but the reality was a slow-motion grind. This congestion not only delayed the advance but also created a perfect, concentrated target for the Allied air forces, if and when the weather ever cleared. The most fatal flaw, however, was fuel. The German High Command had started the offensive with critically low reserves. The entire operation was predicated on a fantastical assumption that the armored spearheads would capture massive Allied fuel dumps intact. It was a plan built on hope, not logistics. How could a German army, which was increasingly reliant on horses and was far less motorized than its opponent, expect to outrun a fully mechanized American army to its own supply depots? It was a logical absurdity that revealed the sheer desperation at the heart of the planning. As the advance deepened, German tanks began, quite literally, to run out of gas, their crews abandoning them on the side of the road. Even the much-vaunted German special operations proved to be little more than strategically insignificant sideshows. Operation Stosser, an airborne drop to seize key crossroads, was a fiasco. Inexperienced pilots flying in bad weather scattered the paratroopers over a vast area, and they were quickly hunted down. Operation Grief, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, saw German commandos in American uniforms and captured jeeps infiltrate Allied lines to sow confusion. They did cause some initial paranoia, leading to American sentries asking bizarre baseball trivia questions to verify identities, but they were rapidly neutralized and had no tangible effect on the battle's outcome. While the German offensive was bogging down under the weight of its own flawed design, the Allied response, after the initial shock, was a model of speed and decisiveness. At his headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. He famously told his stunned staff, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." He saw that by attacking, Hitler had exposed his last reserves. He immediately ordered his two most powerful strategic reserve units, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions refitting in France, to be trucked to the front. This rapid deployment, something the rigid German command structure struggled to emulate, was a key factor in stabilizing the front. The crucial ripple effect of this decision was felt at a small, unassuming Belgian town that was a hub for 7 critical roads, Bastogne. As German armor flowed past it on all sides, the 101st Airborne, along with elements of other units, rushed in just in time to establish a perimeter. Bastogne became an island of resistance, an immovable anvil in the path of the German advance. Its defense, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, became legendary. When the German commander sent a demand for surrender on December 22nd, McAuliffe, perplexed, initially didn't know how to respond. He eventually settled on a one-word reply that would echo through American military history. Nuts! It was a symbol of defiant, gritty American resolve that electrified the Allied world. The German decision to bypass Bastogne and leave a secondary force to lay siege to it was another catastrophic error. The town's defenders tied down significant German forces and completely snarled the logistics of the 5th Panzer Army. If Bastogne was the anvil, the hammer was already swinging. At a crisis meeting on December 19th, Eisenhower asked his commanders for a plan. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, stunned the room. When asked how long it would take him to disengage from his own offensive, turn his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and attack the German southern flank, he replied without hesitation, 48 hours. He had, with incredible foresight, already been wargaming such a scenario. Patton's Third Army began its historic northward march, a brilliant feat of logistics and command, to relieve the besieged defenders of Bastogne. This brings us to the twist, the truth that lies opposite the myth. The Germans were not defeated by a last-minute miracle or a lucky break. They were defeated by the sum total of their own strategic fallacies and the inherent strengths of their opponent. They were defeated by the unglamorous courage of American engineers blowing bridges and holding roadblocks. They were defeated by the devastating accuracy of American artillery, which the Germans called the true king of the battlefield. They were defeated by an Allied command structure that, while caught by surprise, proved to be flexible, decisive, and capable of wielding overwhelming material power. The great German offensive hadn't just been stopped. It had been strategically outmaneuvered and was now in danger of being caught in a trap of its own making. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The tide of the battle definitively turned on December 23, 1944. On that day, the dense gray clouds that had shielded the German advance for a week finally broke. The sun appeared in a brilliant, cold blue sky. For the besieged defenders of Bastogne, it was a miracle. For the German soldiers in the frozen forests and on the clogged roads, it was the beginning of the end. The Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, were unleashed. They swarmed over the Ardennes, transforming the German columns into a shooting gallery. They strafed trucks, bombed tank concentrations, and hunted down anything that moved. The German advance, which had already ground to a halt due to fuel shortages and stiff resistance, now died completely, frozen in place by Allied air supremacy. On Christmas Eve, the spearhead of the 2nd Panzer Division reached within a few miles of the Meuse River near Dinant, the high-water mark of the entire offensive. It was a hollow achievement. The unit was out of fuel, isolated, and about to be annihilated. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and relieved Bastogne, punching a corridor to the besieged town. The great German gamble was officially over. What followed was not a strategic withdrawal, but a brutal, grinding battle of attrition as the Allies sought to systematically crush the German armies caught in the Bulge. Yet, even in the face of certain defeat, the Nazi regime launched one final, suicidal act of defiance. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, executed Operation Bodenplatte. In a single, massive, coordinated strike, nearly 1,000 German aircraft, all that was left of the fighter force on the Western Front, took off to attack Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The attack achieved tactical surprise, destroying over 260 Allied aircraft on the ground. But the strategic cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost over 300 aircraft, and more importantly, more than 200 pilots, including dozens of irreplaceable veteran aces. Allied losses, both in planes and pilots, were replaced within weeks. The Luftwaffes were not. In one day, it effectively committed suicide, ceasing to exist as a coherent fighting force for the remainder of the war. The most profound long-term consequence of Hitler's Ardennes fantasy, however, was felt not in the west, but hundreds of miles to the east. To try and salvage something from the Ardennes disaster, and to pursue his obsession with the oil fields in Hungary, Hitler ordered the most powerful units, including the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, to be withdrawn from the Ardennes and transferred to the Eastern Front. This stripped the German defenses on the Vistula River of their last mobile reserves. The timing could not have been worse. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched its Vistula-Oder Offensive, a tidal wave of millions of men and tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. The German front, hollowed out to fuel the Ardennes gamble, shattered completely. The Red Army advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, reaching the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge didn't just fail to win the war in the West, it guaranteed and accelerated the catastrophic loss of the war in the East. The universal lesson of the Battle of the Bulge is a timeless warning against the deadly allure of wishful thinking. It stands as a monumental case study in the dangers of authoritarian leadership, where the delusions of a single individual, isolated from reality and intolerant of dissent, can drive a nation to ruin. Hitler's plan was a rejection of logistics, intelligence, and military science in favor of a fanatical belief in willpower. The Ardennes Forest became the graveyard of this philosophy. It proved, in blood and frozen steel, that courage and ideology, no matter how fervent, cannot defeat the grim mathematics of war: fuel, ammunition, food, and overwhelming firepower. This lesson resonates with unnerving clarity in the modern world. We continue to see conflicts launched by leaders who fall prey to the same hubris. Leaders who believe their own propaganda, who underestimate their adversaries' will to resist, and who launch high-risk gambles in the pursuit of a short, victorious war to solve their political problems. They forget that war has its own brutal logic, one that is indifferent to ideology and mercilessly punishes those who ignore the realities of supply, terrain, and morale. The Battle of the Bulge is a stark, 80-year-old reminder that confirmation bias and nationalistic fervor are the seeds of military disaster. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge was gone. The front line was more or less back to where it had been on December 15th. But the strategic landscape had been irrevocably altered. The Wehrmacht had suffered over 80,000 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks and aircraft it could never replace. Its last offensive capability was utterly destroyed. The Americans had suffered terribly, with over 86,100 dead and tens of thousands more wounded or captured, but their losses were replaceable. Their industrial might was untouched. Their resolve was hardened. The snows of that terrible winter have long since melted, and the trees of the Ardennes have grown back, covering the scars of war. But the legacy of that battle endures. It was not the heroic last stand of a proud army. It was the death throw of a criminal regime. It was a battle won not by charismatic generals moving pins on a map, but by the anonymous, dogged courage of ordinary men, cooks, clerks, engineers, and riflemen who were thrown into the crucible of the coldest winter in living memory. They were outnumbered, often surrounded, and fighting for their lives. And yet, they held the line. They refused to break. Their sacrifice in the face of that final, desperate Nazi offensive ensured that the road to Berlin and to the final destruction of the Third Reich was now, at long last, wide open.